What if the very thing that symbolized your heritage, your pride, your identity, was stolen from you at 30,000 feet? Imagine boarding a plane, ticket in hand, heart full of dreams, only to have a uniformed stranger decide you didn't belong, not because of your behavior, not because of your ticket, but because of your hair, because of your crown. This is the story of Jordan Miles, a brilliant 19-year-old whose journey to a life-changing conference was brutally interrupted when a flight attendant put scissors to his locks, cutting not just his hair, but his dignity. What happened next wasn't just a confrontation. It was a spark that ignited a storm that shook an entire industry and forced a reckoning no one could ignore. But here's the question. You need to ask yourself, how far can one act of arrogance go, and how powerful can one act of courage be in response? Buckle up, because what unfolded on that plane will make your blood boil, and maybe, just maybe, restore your faith in justice. Before we dive in, do your part, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, that steady vibration beneath the floor that reminded every passenger they were about to leave the ground and trust their lives to a metal body cutting through the clouds. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and recycled air mixed with the faint tang of jet fuel that still clung to the aisles. Flight attendants were directing passengers into their seats with polite smiles, their movements sharp and practiced, the choreography of 1,000 departures. In the middle of all that ordered chaos sat a boy who wasn't really a boy anymore, but not quite yet a man. His name was Jordan Miles, 19 years old, from Atlanta, Georgia. To most of the passengers sliding their carry-ons into the overhead bins, he was just another traveler in business class. But to Jordan, this moment was monumental. He shifted in the wide leather seat that seemed far too grand for him. His legs stretched out more comfortably than they ever had in an airplane, and he tried not to look too obvious when his fingers traced the stitching along the armrest. It felt unreal. He had been on planes before coach, cramped, head pressed against the cold plastic window, but this was different. This was the first time in his life he had stepped into business class. A reward, a recognition, a kind of coronation for years of late nights and relentless dedication. On the tray table rested his most precious possession for this trip, a slim folder of notes and diagrams, equations, algorithms, ideas scribbled in his quick handwriting. He was on his way to Boston to present at a science conference where he was one of the youngest ever invited to speak. For him, the ticket wasn't about champagne, legroom, or being called sir by flight attendants. It was a symbol. Proof that his grind, his brilliance, and his sacrifices were carrying him higher. Literally. Still, as he leaned back and felt the hush of luxury around him, Jordan's hand instinctively reached up to his hair. His dreadlocks cascaded past his shoulders. Thick, neatly kept, each one moisturized and cared for with the patience of years. He didn't just wear them. He honored them. They were his crown. His grandmother, Evelyn, had told him stories since he was little. Stories about Ghana, about kings who carried the weight of their people with pride. She had spoken of the Ashanti, of the golden stool, of braided hair as a mark of identity and strength. Your locks, she would say, touching his head when he was just a boy, are not just hair. They are the roots of our story. They connect you to something bigger than this world will ever admit. That morning, as always, he had spent almost half an hour tending to them, applying oils, twisting gently, checking each one in the mirror before leaving for the airport. He wanted them perfect. Today was not just a flight, it was a beginning. And when his father saw him later, Jordan wanted him to see the crown shining. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines calm the swirl in his stomach. He could still hear his father's voice from their video call earlier that morning. Every day at 6:30 a.m., without fail, David Miles called, no matter where he was in the world. Dubai, New York, London, it didn't matter. That time was sacred on the phone. David's voice had softened, losing its boardroom authority and finding the tone of a father who loved his only son more than anything else on earth. Lord, his father had prayed, head bowed, even on a glowing phone screen. Protect my boy's mind and spirit. Let his crown shine as a symbol of your glory and our family's strength. And let him remember today that he is a king. Excellence is his birthright. Jordan had felt his chest swell, even his nervousness gnawed at the edges. He wanted so badly to live up to that prayer, to prove to his father, to his grandmother, and to himself that he belonged in every room, every stage, every cabin of life. But as the passengers around him settled, Jordan caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glossy surface of the seat divider. For a moment, he hesitated. Do I look out of place, he thought? Do these people see me as I am a scholar, a finalist, a son, or just as some kid who doesn't belong here? It was a thought he hated himself for having. But it came anyway. He noticed the sideways glance from a suited man across the aisle, the way another passenger shifted their briefcase closer. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it didn't matter. He tried to let the hum of the engines drown it out. And yet, beneath his pride, beneath his calm exterior, there was that flicker of unease. The world had a way of reminding you that even when you earned your seat, some would always see it as borrowed. He opened his notebook, trying to refocus on the algorithms he would soon be explaining to an audience of experts twice his age. But his mind drifted back to that morning's call, his father's voice, his grandmother's stories, the crown on his head. Jordan inhaled deeply, grounding himself. He thought, I worked for this. I deserve this. No one can take this moment from me. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warm but authoritative, announcing their imminent departure. Passengers clicked seat belts into place. The plane shifted as it backed from the gate. Jordan smiled, almost to himself. He imagined telling his father later about how it felt to take off, the view, the sense of being above it all. He pictured the call they would share, the pride in his father's eyes, the way his grandmother would beam when she saw him step onto that Boston stage. For now, though, he closed his notebook, leaned back, and let his hand rest lightly on his crown of locks. The engines roared louder. The plane began its surge down the runway, and Jordan Miles, son of Atlanta, genius in the making, sat there with a heart full of hope, unaware that at 30,000 feet, his crown would soon be placed on trial. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft climbed through layers of pale morning clouds. Jordan pressed his head gently against the headrest, his heart finally slowing from the rush of takeoff. For a few minutes, he let himself believe this flight would be ordinary, that he could simply close his eyes, wake up in Boston, and step into the conference hall as the young scientist who belonged there. But memories have a way of filling the silence. The whir of the engines reminded him of his morning ritual, the anchor that steadied him through years of work, doubt, and sacrifice. Every day at 6:30 sharp, his phone chimed. Every day without fail, he saw his father's face appear on the glowing screen. It didn't matter if David Miles was in a hotel overlooking the Dubai skyline or in an office tower in Manhattan. It didn't matter if it was midnight in one city or dawn in another. 6:30 Atlanta time was reserved for his son. Jordan remembered how that call had begun today. His phone buzzed, and even before he answered, he knew what he would see his father in a crisp shirt, tie loosened, the fatigue of negotiations still etched on his features, but his eyes softened with warmth. Behind him, the tall glass windows of the hotel revealed a blur of skyscrapers and the faint shimmer of the Persian Gulf. Ready to own the day. Son, David's voice carried that familiar mix of pride and encouragement. Jordan had laughed nervously, rubbing his palm over his locks. I think so. I just hope I don't stumble over my slides. His father leaned closer to the camera, his tone shifting into that ritual seriousness Jordan had come to expect. Slides don't matter as much as presence. When you walk into that room, you carry generations with you. Remember what your grandmother always says. That crown of yours isn't just style. It's history. It's honor. It's your inheritance. Jordan felt his throat tighten even now as he replayed those words. Sometimes he wished he had his father's composure, that commanding calm that made CEOs bend to his will. But inside, Jordan often wrestled with a storm. Will they respect me? Will they see me as I am? Or only as what they assume? He had never said those fears aloud to his father. To do so felt like admitting weakness. And David Miles didn't raise a son to doubt himself. The call had continued with their shared prayer. They did it every morning, a ritual that went beyond religion. It was their covenant, their invisible armor. His father bowed his head, his voice dropping low. Lord, protect my boy's mind and spirit. Let his crown shine as a symbol of your glory and our family's strength. Let him know that he is a king. His excellence is his birthright. And let today's seat in business class be only the first of many thrones he will occupy. Jordan had whispered, Amen, though his eyes had stung with unshed tears. He wanted to believe every word. He wanted to wear that confidence as easily as his father did. Yet doubt always lingered in the background like static in a call. After they prayed, his father's tone softened. I know you stayed up late again. Don't burn yourself out, Jordan. You've worked harder than anyone I know, but rest is part of greatness too. Jordan smiled faintly at the memory. His father's words were both comfort and burden. Rest was a luxury he rarely allowed himself. Since middle school, he'd driven himself with relentless intensity. While other kids hung out at the mall, Jordan was building circuits and reading about quantum computing. While his classmates crammed the night before exams, Jordan was awake until dawn, testing theories most adults couldn't even pronounce. The path had never been easy. Atlanta was home, but the neighborhood wasn't always safe. There were distractions, temptations, the constant low thrum of people expecting him to be another statistic. Teachers doubted him until his grades silenced them. Neighbors shook their heads until scholarships proved them wrong. But there had been one constant: his crown. He began growing his dreadlocks at 13, inspired by the stories his grandmother told on warm evenings when cicadas sang outside her porch. She would braid his hair slowly, her fingers patient, her voice filled with history. She told him about warriors and kings, about how hair carried spirit, strength, and identity. At first, the locks were short and stubborn. Kids teased him, saying he looked messy, unkempt. Teachers hinted he should cut them to look professional. Jordan had thought about it once. He had stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, scissors in hand. He almost gave in, almost surrendered to that pressure to conform. But then his grandmother knocked gently on the door, her voice tender. "Baby, don't you dare cut off your crown for someone else's comfort. This world will try to shrink you every chance it gets, but you hold your ground. You let your hair grow with your spirit. Both deserve room." That night, Jordan put the scissors away. From then on, every inch of growth felt like defiance and triumph. Every twist, every bead of oil was a declaration, "I am enough. I belong, now." Sitting thousands of feet in the air, that memory flooded him with warmth. He touched his locks, feeling the weight of 6 years of care. They weren't just hair. They were a timeline of his becoming. Still, unease persisted. Jordan knew the world had never been kind to crowns like his. He had seen news stories, heard whispers from classmates' parents, felt the sideways stares when he walked into spaces that weren't used to seeing young black men excel. And though he sat in a wide seat that he had earned, he could already sense the question in the air around him. Do you really belong here? He opened his folder, flipping through pages filled with diagrams and notes. The equations blurred as his mind wandered. He imagined walking into the Boston conference, standing on that stage, dozens of eyes watching him. Would they see a scholar, or would they see a boy with locks, trying too hard to reach above his station? The internal struggle tightened in his chest. He pressed his lips together, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He had done this before, carried that weight. He knew how to smile through it, how to let his achievements speak louder than anyone's prejudice. But it was exhausting. And in the quiet of the cabin, as engines hummed and clouds rolled by outside the window, he admitted to himself what he never admitted to anyone else. Sometimes, he was tired of carrying the burden of proving himself worthy. Sometimes, he just wanted to be. He whispered to himself, so softly no one could hear, "You belong, Jordan. Don't forget that." The plane leveled off. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and flight attendants began their routine of serving drinks. Jordan watched them move gracefully through the aisles, their uniforms crisp, their smiles practiced. He didn't notice the one set of eyes that lingered a little too long on him. The gaze of someone who had already decided he did not fit her image of this cabin. For now, he closed his folder, leaned back, and allowed himself a brief smile. He thought of the moment when he would call his father again, tell him about the view from the sky, about the thrill of stepping into his future. He imagined his grandmother's proud nod when he described how people clapped after his presentation. The morning call still echoed in his ears, a reminder of love, strength, and expectation, and though he wrestled with doubt, though fear gnawed quietly in the shadows of his heart, Jordan held on to one truth: he had earned his place. What he could not know was how quickly that truth would be tested, how suddenly the crown his father and grandmother cherished would be placed under attack. For now, though, he sat with hope. The engines whispered steady, the clouds parted, and Jordan Miles, crowned with heritage, flew forward into a future that shimmered just beyond the horizon. The aisle glimmered with overhead light as passengers settled deeper into their seats, adjusting blankets, opening magazines, clicking seat belts. Jordan tried to lose himself in the quiet rhythm of travel, but something unsettled lingered in the cabin air, almost imperceptible, like a draft no one else noticed. It came not from the hum of the engines or the shuffle of passengers, but from the gaze of one woman who moved with a practiced authority. Her name was Linda Hayes. To most of the travelers, she was simply the senior flight attendant, crisp in her Navy uniform, hair pinned back, smile practiced to perfection. She looked like the epitome of professionalism, the kind of attendant passengers assumed would keep order in the skies. But beneath that neatly pressed exterior lived something far less polished. Linda had been in the airline industry for over 20 years. 2 decades of long flights, swollen feet, impatient passengers, and endless corporate training sessions. Once, early in her career, she'd been promoted to supervisor, a position she bragged about to friends and family. But the glory had faded. A series of customer complaints, some minor, some not so minor, stripped her of the title and returned her to the aisles she once thought she had risen above. That humiliation had festered. Each demotion, each stern email from management, each shift where younger attendants outshone her, etched bitterness deeper into her bones. She smiled for passengers, but resentment simmered behind her eyes. She despised those who reminded her of what she had lost. More than anything, she despised what she could not control, the slow but undeniable shift in who occupied the seats she believed defined prestige. She had grown used to a certain image in business class: men in dark suits, women in muted dresses, polished hair, subdued laughter, a homogeneous portrait of wealth that comforted her in its predictability. But, as the years passed, she saw more names she stumbled over on the manifest, more skin tones that didn't match her tidy image, more crowns of curls, braids, twists, and locks that in her private vocabulary she considered unkempt. She had developed her own private system of judgment, what she smugly called her standard of presentation. It was not written in any manual. It was not supported by corporate policy. But, to her, it was law. When she saw someone who did not fit her vision of refinement in the premium cabin, she felt it was her duty to correct, to enforce, to remind. And now, moving gracefully down the aisle, she caught sight of Jordan Miles. He sat with his notebook open, pen tapping nervously against the margin, locks tumbling across his shoulders. His posture radiated a mix of excitement and nerves, the unmistakable glow of youth stepping into a new chapter. To any fair observer, he looked immaculate. His clothes were neat, his demeanor polite. But Linda's eyes narrowed. To her, he was an intruder. She paused for a moment near row 3, adjusting a seatbelt for an elderly man, but her gaze flicked back to Jordan again and again. Something about him stirred not just annoyance but a raw, personal irritation. Perhaps it was his age, 19, maybe 20, far too young in her mind to occupy such a seat. Perhaps it was his confidence, the way he looked like he belonged, as though he had earned the right to be there. Or perhaps it was the crown of locks, gleaming under the cabin light, each one a quiet proclamation of heritage and pride. That crown struck her like an offense. She would never admit it aloud, but in her mind it was unprofessional. It clashed with the image she worked so hard to maintain. And she had power here, however small. This was her cabin, her rules. As she continued her walk down the aisle, she rehearsed the language she might use. Corporate jargon was her shield. She never risked her job with obvious slurs or insults. Instead, She wrapped her prejudice in sterile words like policy, presentation, professional image. She had done it before, and management rarely questioned her authority. Passengers complained, of course, but her explanations always sounded official enough to shield her from consequence. What she did not realize was that this time, her target was not just any young traveler. Jordan Miles carried with him not only his notes and his hopes, but the unwavering strength of a family that would stop at nothing to protect him. Linda had no idea that her small, bitter act of control would unleash forces far beyond her imagination. But, for now, she simply adjusted her skirt, smoothed her blouse, and allowed her lips to curve into the faintest smile. She had found her project for this flight. Jordan, unaware of the storm forming just a few rows away, scribbled a few more notes on his page. He tried to ignore the subtle glances he thought he felt, the flicker of unease that whispered in his chest. He told himself he was imagining it. He told himself he was safe here, high above the clouds. Linda stopped briefly at the galley, retrieving a small binder she carried with her. She liked to keep it visible, though its contents were mostly generic reminders about service protocols. For her, the binder was a prop, a symbol of authority she could wave when she needed to make her judgment sound official. She tapped it against her palm, her mind already spinning with the words she would use. "Your hairstyle," she imagined saying, "does not align with our premium standards. Or, perhaps, we have a code of appearance for this cabin." The exact phrasing didn't matter. What mattered was the effect. The boy would shrink, embarrassed, unsure. He would comply or he would leave. Either way, she would restore the order she craved. She leaned against the counter for a moment, eyes fixed on the reflection in the polished metal. To others, she looked like a dedicated employee preparing for service. Inside, she was bracing herself for the small thrill of control that had become her only satisfaction. The engines droned on. The passengers murmured softly. Jordan Miles tapped his pen, oblivious, and Linda Hayes, senior flight attendant, quietly declared war on a crown she had already decided did not belong in her cabin. The cabin had settled into its rhythm. The rush of boarding had quieted. The shuffling of carry-ons replaced by the softer hum of the aircraft pressing forward through the sky. Some passengers flipped open laptops, already immersed in emails. Others pulled blankets over their laps, surrendering to sleep. But one woman in seat 5B sat upright, her eyes scanning the cabin with a practiced attentiveness that came from decades of watching over people. Her name was Patricia Moore, 50 years old, a registered nurse from Houston, Texas. To most on board, she was just another tired traveler heading home after a long conference. Her curly hair was tucked neatly under a scarf, her posture calm, her demeanor quiet, but there was more behind those eyes than fatigue. Patricia had spent nearly 30 years in emergency rooms. She had seen blood, chaos, and despair. She had worked double shifts when hospitals overflowed, stayed on her feet when her body screamed for rest. She had held the hands of patients taking their last breaths and whispered comfort to families who had lost everything. In her line of work, she had seen the best and worst of humanity compressed into long nights under fluorescent lights. That life left marks, not all visible. She carried herself with resilience, but the years had carved lines of weariness along her face. She had grown strong because she had no choice. A single mother of 2 boys, she had raised them while balancing 12-hour shifts, bills that always seemed to arrive faster than paychecks, and the constant fear of losing them to a world that often saw young black men as disposable. Her oldest, Marcus Jr., was 26 now, a firefighter in Dallas. Her youngest, Michael, was 22, finishing college. Both were tall, proud young men, but when she looked at them, she still saw the little boys who clung to her scrubs after her late shifts. She had built her life around keeping them safe, teaching them how to survive in a country that didn't always value their survival. That was why, when she noticed Jordan Miles in row 4A, her heart stirred in recognition. She didn't know him. She'd never seen his face before today. But the moment her eyes lingered on him, she felt the pull of instinct, the maternal radar that had been honed through years of protecting her own sons. He reminded her of Michael. The same slender build, the same brightness in the eyes, the same nervous way of tapping a pen when deep in thought. She saw his locks, well cared for and proud, and felt the rush of admiration that always came when she saw a young black man refusing to hide his heritage. Patricia had spent too many nights in ER waiting rooms, holding mothers whose sons had been belittled, brutalized, or broken by forces larger than them. Seeing Jordan's quiet pride was like seeing the sun break through clouds. She wanted to lean across the aisle, to tell him, "You look powerful. You look like my son. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small." Instead, she smiled faintly and returned to her book, though she hardly read the words. Her thoughts drifted. She remembered the time when Michael, just 16, had come home in tears because a teacher told him his braids looked unprofessional. She had held him in the kitchen, furious and helpless, whispering that his hair was beautiful, that no one had the right to make him feel ashamed. She had written an email to the school that night, shaking with anger as she typed, but nothing had changed. The teacher apologized half-heartedly, and Michael carried the wound silently for years. Patricia's chest tightened as she thought about that memory. Watching Jordan across the aisle now, she prayed silently. Please let his journey be different. Please let the world treat him with the dignity he deserves. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Linda Hayes passed by. Patricia's eyes followed the attendant's movements. Something about the way Linda glanced at Jordan set off alarms in Patricia's gut. It wasn't obvious. To the untrained eye, it was just a look, quick and dismissive. But Patricia had spent her life reading faces. In the ER, one glance could tell her if a patient was about to collapse. She could spot arrogance, fear, contempt in seconds. And what she saw in Linda's eyes was not professionalism. It was disdain. Patricia's fingers tightened around her book. She didn't want to assume the worst. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe Linda was just tired, frustrated by something else. Still, the unease stayed. Her instincts had been sharpened by years of watching injustice unfold quietly in rooms where no one else spoke up. She had learned that silence could be dangerous. Jordan remained unaware, lost in his notes, his head bobbing slightly to a rhythm only he heard. Patricia studied him again. She thought of her sons. She thought of the endless warnings she had drilled into them. Keep your hands visible. Speak politely, even when they don't. Walk away if you can. But don't ever surrender your dignity. She hated that she had to teach them survival rules others never had to consider. She hated that the world demanded so much composure from boys who only wanted to live freely. A flight attendant's gaze wouldn't normally raise alarms. But Patricia had lived long enough to know that injustice rarely announced itself loudly. It crept in through small gestures, condescending words, humiliations disguised as policies. It was always there, waiting for a chance to strike. Her thoughts drifted again, this time to the nursing conference she had just attended in Chicago. The lectures had been exhausting, the networking superficial. But one workshop stayed with her: cultural competence in healthcare. The speaker had asked a simple question: who protects the vulnerable when the system fails them? Patricia had written in her notes, "Sometimes it's us. Sometimes we are the last line of defense." She didn't know then how quickly that note would become her reality. The plane shifted slightly, turbulence brushing against the wings. Some passengers stirred awake. Patricia steadied her coffee cup and looked again at Jordan. He hadn't noticed Linda's lingering gaze. He hadn't noticed the way the attendant's hand tightened briefly around the handle of her service kit. He was too busy underlining words in his notebook, mouthing sentences silently as if practicing for his presentation. Patricia smiled softly. She wished she could tell him how proud she was of him, a stranger she had never met. She wished she could tell him she saw not just a young man, but a reflection of all the boys and men who had fought to hold their crowns against the world's weight. For now, she sat quietly. She watched. She waited. And though she did not yet know it, the moment would soon come when silence would no longer be an option. The moment would come when her instincts as a nurse, as a mother, as a protector would collide with the injustice unfolding in the aisle before her. Patricia Moore did not think of herself as a hero. She was simply a woman trying to make it through another flight, another day, another stretch of life's demands. But fate had a way of choosing unlikely people to hold the line. And before this flight touched the ground, her voice would echo louder than she had ever imagined, carrying not just her own fury, but the fury of generations. For now, though she sat in seat 5B, sipping coffee, watching over a boy with a crown of locks, and bracing herself for something she could not yet name. The plane had settled into its steady rhythm, the engines humming like a distant song. The cabin lights glowed soft gold, and the air carried the faint scent of coffee, fabric, and metal. Business class had grown quiet. Passengers falling into their routines. A few worked on laptops. Some slept with eye masks pulled low. Others flipped casually through magazines, waiting for the hours to slide by. Jordan sat in 4A, pen tapping nervously on the margin of his notebook. He was rehearsing a line from his upcoming presentation, mouthing the words silently as though he were already on stage in Boston. Every so often, he reached up, touched one of his locks, and reminded himself of his father's prayer, his grandmother's stories, the unspoken promise he carried. But the comfort of those memories was beginning to fade. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger. He could feel it on his skin like a draft of cold air. He looked up briefly, scanning the aisle, and caught sight of Linda Hayes. She was moving with practiced grace, checking seat belts, adjusting headrests, leaning down to collect a half-finished glass of orange juice from one passenger. Her smile was painted on, perfect for strangers, but her eyes were sharp, searching, calculating. When they landed on Jordan, the smile faltered. Jordan blinked, lowering his eyes back to his notes. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just doing her job. But his stomach tightened. He knew the difference between attention and scrutiny. This was not attention. This was judgment. A few minutes later, Linda reappeared with her service cart, offering drinks to passengers in the front rows. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, still water red or white wine coffee. Each request was met with polite thanks, clinking glasses, and murmured conversation. When she reached Jordan, she paused. "Something to drink, sir." Her tone was courteous, but the pause stretched a second too long. Jordan looked up, forcing a smile. "Just water, please." She poured it with deliberate slowness, her eyes lingering on his hair. Headed to Boston for business, Jordan hesitated. For a conference, science conference. She tilted her head, as if surprised. "Science." At your age, Jordan gave a small nod. "I'm presenting research." The faint smile she offered didn't reach her eyes. She set the glass down, then leaned just slightly closer. "Make sure you're representing yourself well. First impressions matter in these cabins." Jordan's chest tightened. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. The words dripped with that kind of polished condescension that carried meaning without saying anything directly. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but instead he took the water, murmured thanks, and looked back at his notes. Linda continued down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. But the moment lingered. Jordan's thoughts spun. Did she just mean my clothes, or was she talking about my hair? Am I imagining this? He tapped his pen harder, frustration building. He had heard variations of those words before. Represent yourself well. First impressions matter. They were always said politely, always cloaked in professionalism, but the subtext was clear. You don't fit the image. He closed his notebook, staring out the window at the endless stretch of clouds. His heart was heavy. He whispered silently to himself, "Stay calm. Don't overthink it. Focus on Boston." Across the aisle in 5B, Patricia Moore had seen the exchange. She watched Linda's posture, the way her body leaned toward Jordan, the subtle narrowing of her eyes. Patricia's instincts hummed like an alarm bell. She knew that tone. She had seen it used on her own sons, in classrooms, in stores, even at hospital check-ins. Polite words masking the sting of dismissal. She wanted to say something, to reach across the aisle. But Jordan had already turned back to the window, and Patricia stayed silent. For now, Linda returned the cart to the galley, her mind already circling. She couldn't quite explain why this boy unsettled her. Maybe it was his youth. Maybe his confidence. Maybe the quiet pride in the way he carried himself. But it gnawed at her. To her, business class demanded a certain aesthetic, a certain uniformity, and his locks beautiful, strong, defiant were in her mind an intrusion. She touched the edge of her service binder, flipping through laminated pages that contained nothing about hairstyles or appearances. Yet she told herself she could make it work. She had always been skilled at bending the vague into authority. She rehearsed the words in her head: appearance standards, professional image, passenger comfort. By the time she returned to the aisle again, her decision was made. Jordan had been trying to refocus, forcing himself to underline phrases in his notes. But when Linda stopped in front of his seat, his pen froze. She was no longer smiling. Her expression carried the faint severity of someone about to enforce rules. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice smooth but firm. "I need to have a word with you." Jordan looked up, startled. "Is there a problem?" She glanced briefly at the passengers around them, as though inviting an audience, then lowered her eyes back to him. "It's about your appearance. Our premium cabins have certain expectations." The words landed like stones in Jordan's chest. He gripped his pen tighter. my appearance. Yes, she said, gesturing faintly toward his hair. We ask passengers in business class to present a professional aesthetic. It's part of maintaining the standard for this cabin. Jordan's throat went dry. My ticket is valid. I'm dressed neatly. What exactly is the problem? Linda folded her hands, her binder tucked against her hip like a weapon. We'll need to address this before the flight continues. It's about consistency and professionalism. For a moment, Jordan couldn't move. The hum of the engines faded. The chatter of passengers dissolved. All he could hear was his father's voice that morning, telling him his crown was his glory, his grandmother's reminder that his locks carried history. And here, thousands of feet above the ground, someone was trying to strip it all away with a smile and a policy that didn't exist. He swallowed hard. His heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at him to stay polite, to keep calm, to survive the moment. But another part of him, the part nurtured by prayers and stories, burned with defiance. "Can I speak to a supervisor?" he asked, his voice trembling but controlled. Linda's lips curved into a thin smile. "I am the supervisor for this cabin." She stood there, unwavering, her authority pressing down like cabin pressure tightening in the lungs. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, though every ear was tuned to the exchange. Phones began to rise quietly, cameras blinking red. Patricia gripped the armrest of her seat. Her chest burned with recognition. She had seen this before. She knew where it could lead, and she also knew that silence, in this moment, was complicity. She sat forward, her breath catching, waiting for the moment when her voice would be needed. Jordan sat frozen in his seat, his crown heavy on his head, the words of his father echoing in his mind. "Excellence is your birthright," he wondered, with dread and fury colliding in his chest, if that birthright was about to be cut away. The hum of the engines filled the silence that stretched across row 4. Jordan could feel every eye in the cabin, though most passengers tried to mask their interest by staring at their screens or flipping pages they weren't really reading. He sat frozen, his pen still in his hand, his chest heavy with the weight of Linda Hayes's words. She stood with perfect posture, her binder pressed firmly against her hip. Her face carried the expression of someone convinced she was in the right, as though she were the guardian of order in the skies. "Your hairstyle," she said again, her voice quieter now, pitched just enough for nearby passengers to catch the edges of her words, "does not align with our standards for this cabin." Jordan's pulse raced. He wanted to ask her what standards, to demand proof. But he had been in situations like this before, not in business class seats, but in classrooms, stores, and lobbies where authority disguised its prejudice in polite phrases. He had learned that the wrong reaction could turn a small slight into something catastrophic. "My hair is clean," Jordan said carefully. His voice wavered but carried determination. "It's neat. I take care of it." What exactly is unprofessional about it? Linda's lips twitched into a smile that was more condescension than kindness. "It's about maintaining a professional image for the passengers around you. We do have an expectation of uniform presentation in premium cabins." She tapped her binder lightly, as if the vague collection of service notes it contained were scripture. "It's important to project refinement in this section of the aircraft. It's what passengers pay for." Jordan's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, to tell her she was humiliating him for no reason. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. Stay calm. Stay measured. Excellence is your birthright. He took a breath, forcing control over the storm in his chest. Could you please show me where in your policy it says that, he asked. The question hung in the air. Linda's eyes hardened. For a moment, she looked as though she had been challenged in a courtroom. Then her smile returned, practiced and sharp. I don't need to show you, she replied. I am telling you as the supervisor in charge of this cabin. Either we address your appearance or you will need to relocate. Jordan's heart sank. Relocate. The word carried weight. It meant being forced out of the seat he had dreamed of. The seat his father had given him to honor his work. The seat that symbolized everything he had earned. He thought of the call that morning, his father praying over him, his grandmother's stories of kings who wore their crowns with pride. He felt the texture of his locks under his fingertips, the years of patience and care woven into each strand. Relocate. The word echoed in his skull like thunder. Around him, passengers began to shift. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat and looked away. A woman clutched her husband's arm, whispering. Phones angled discreetly, recording. The silence of the crowd was deafening, louder than shouts. Jordan felt his skin burn under the weight of their stares. He whispered, almost without realizing, Dad, I wish you were here. His hands fumbled for his phone, though he knew the call wouldn't connect. He unlocked it, tapped his father's name. The call failed, the signal icon mocking him. His chest tightened. He tried again, then again, but the result was the same. The weight of isolation pressed down on him. Desperate. He opened the messaging app, switched to Wi-Fi calling, and sent a quick line to his grandmother. They're saying I can't sit here with my hair. She has scissors. What do I do? It took only seconds for a reply. Her words appeared on the glowing screen, steady and fierce. Don't let anyone touch your crown. Not ever. Jordan's eyes blurred with tears. He gripped the phone tightly, whispering the words to himself like a mantra. Don't let anyone touch your crown. Linda had been watching, her patience thinning. She leaned closer, her tone brisk. Sir, we can resolve this quietly. Let me neaten your hair just enough so it matches our expectations. Or you can move to a different seat when we land. Those are your options. The words sank like ice into Jordan's chest. Neaten your hair. It wasn't about neatness. His locks were immaculate. It was about control, about stripping away the symbol of who he was. His throat tightened. This isn't right, he whispered. Linda tilted her head, her smile faint and cold. It's what's required. For the first time. Jordan's hands trembled visibly. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window beside him. The boy who stared back seemed fragile, his proud locks glowing under the cabin light, his eyes wide with disbelief. In his mind, voices clashed, his father urging calm, his grandmother urging defiance, his own doubts whispering that maybe, just maybe, he should comply to avoid escalation. Maybe it was better to lose a little than risk losing everything. But then another thought pierced through. This seat was more than a cushion of leather. It was a symbol of his father's faith, his grandmother's legacy, his own relentless work. To surrender it meant more than giving up a chair. It meant surrendering the belief that he belonged. Patricia Moore watched all of this unfold from across the aisle. She saw the way Jordan's shoulders hunched, the way his hands shook, the way Linda loomed like a warden disguised as a hostess. Patricia's heart clenched. She saw her sons in him, saw every injustice they had endured, every time they had been told to shrink. Her breath grew heavier. Jordan gripped his phone one last time, whispering into the screen as though his father could hear him across the silence. "Dad, please pick up. Please." The call failed again. The voicemail screen blinked. His father's recorded voice, calm and strong, filled his ear. Jordan broke. His lips trembled. "They want to cut my hair. Dad, what do I do?" But there was no answer. Only the soft hum of the engines. Linda's patience snapped. She set the binder down, opened the service kit at her side, and drew out a pair of silver scissors. Their blades gleamed under the cabin light. She held them firmly, her eyes fixed on Jordan's locks. "Now," she said softly, though her words cut sharper than the steel in her hand, "we are going to fix this. Either you let me make your hair presentable, or you will not remain in this seat. It's your choice." The world tilted. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. The first drop of sweat slid down his temple. He felt his heart pounding as though it might burst through his chest. He gripped his locks, his crown, his heritage, and whispered to himself, "Don't let them touch it." But Linda stepped closer. The scissors raised, and for the first time, Jordan knew that the battle for his dignity was no longer private. It was on trial, in the middle of a cabin, 30,000 feet above the ground, where the entire world seemed to be watching. The cabin felt heavier than the air outside. Every sound seemed amplified: the whir of the engines, the soft clinking of glasses, the rustle of pages. But beneath it all was silence, the kind that presses against the skin, a silence filled with dread. Jordan sat stiff in his seat, his fists clenched tight on the armrests. His heart thundered in his chest. The silver scissors gleamed in Linda Hayes's hand. Their reflection flickered in the cabin lights like cold fire. "Let me take care of this quickly," Linda said, her tone deceptively calm, the kind used to soothe children before a punishment. "It'll be easier for everyone. Easier for everyone." The words echoed cruelly. Jordan's locks were not a problem. They were not an inconvenience. They were a crown, 6 years in the making, each strand carrying the weight of his grandmother's stories, his father's pride, his own patience, and here, at 30,000 feet, a stranger was treating them like clutter to be trimmed. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "Please, don't. This isn't right." Linda's lips tightened. "It's about maintaining standards. We can't allow passengers to disregard presentation rules. Now, stay still. It'll only take a minute." Jordan tried again, his voice louder this time, cracking under the strain. "There is no rule about my hair. I belong in this seat. My ticket is valid." A few heads turned more boldly now. Some passengers frowned, discomfort visible on their faces. Others lifted their phones higher, recording. Still, no one moved, no one intervened. The silence of bystanders pressed like a suffocating fog. Patricia Moore gripped the armrest in 5B until her knuckles whitened. Her instincts screamed at her to get up, to shout, to tear the scissors away, but she waited, breath shallow, her eyes locked on Jordan. She could see his shoulders shaking. She could feel the breaking of his spirit in the way his chest rose and fell too fast, too uneven. Jordan fumbled for his phone again. Desperate, he dialed his father once more. The call spun, searching before going straight to voicemail. His father's recorded voice filled his ear, calm, steady, unreachable. "Dad," Jordan whispered, tears burning his eyes. "They want to cut my hair. They want to take my crown." But the cabin gave him no answer. Linda mistook the tears for surrender. She leaned closer, her scissors raised. "Let's not make a scene," she murmured. "I'll just neaten it up. You'll thank me later." The words snapped something inside him. Jordan knew in that moment, with a clarity that cut sharper than any blade, that this wasn't about neatness, it was about power. It was about reminding him that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how high he climbed, there would always be someone ready to try to drag him down. The blades opened. The cold steel slid around one of his thickest locks. The first snip cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Gasps rippled across the cabin. Jordan's body froze, paralyzed by the audacity of the violation. He felt the lock fall against his shoulder, then tumble soundlessly to the carpeted floor. It lay there, lifeless, a piece of him severed and discarded. His chest convulsed, his vision blurred. Tears streamed down his face as his breath came in ragged sobs. Linda didn't pause. Her hand moved with grotesque precision, grabbing another lock, positioning the blades. Snip. Another piece of him fell. Snip. Another 6 years of patience, of care, of pride, severed in seconds. Jordan's hands twitched, wanting to fight, wanting to stop her, but shock held him captive. The humiliation was crushing, suffocating. Each cut echoed not just in his ears but in his soul, dismantling his identity strand by strand. Around them, passengers sat frozen. Some stared, horrified. Others glanced away, ashamed but unwilling to intervene. A man in a suit shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. A woman across the aisle shook her head, muttering under her breath, but stayed seated. Phones continued to record, their little red lights capturing every cruel snip, documenting the crime. Patricia felt her throat close. She couldn't take it anymore, but she held herself still for a moment longer, watching the horror unfold, fury building inside her like magma under stone. Jordan's voice broke through the silence, soft, trembling, desperate. "Please, please stop." Linda's hand didn't hesitate. She cut again. Snip, snip. His crown was butchered, uneven, destroyed. She stepped back finally, admiring her work as though she had done him a favor. "There," she said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "Much better. Now you look like you belong in business class." Jordan turned his head slowly, catching his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The sight shattered him. His locks, once neat and proud, were jagged, hacked, uneven. His crown had been mutilated, torn apart by hands that had no right to touch it. Shame crushed him. He bowed his head, tears spilling freely, his body trembling with sobs. The humiliation was absolute. He could feel the eyes of the cabin, pitying, judging, condemning. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the seat, to vanish from the world. Patricia could no longer contain herself. She pushed her tray table up with a sharp snap, her chair jerking forward, her voice, raw and furious, erupted into the heavy silence. "What in the ever-loving hell is wrong with you?" Her words boomed through the cabin, louder than the engines, louder than the whispers. Heads turned, phones angled, every passenger focused on her. Jordan lifted his tear-streaked face, stunned. Patricia rose halfway from her seat, her chest heaving, her finger trembling as she pointed at Linda. That was his crown. That was his culture. You had no right. None. Linda turned, startled, her face flashing from confidence to shock. "Ma'am, this is a company matter. Please sit down. Company matter." Patricia's voice shook with rage. "Show me the policy that says you can assault a child. Show me the rule that says you can cut off a boy's hair because you don't like how he looks. You can't, because it doesn't exist." Passengers began to murmur. Some nodded, others whispered, "She's right." That was too much. Linda's composure faltered, her voice thinner now. "Please lower your voice or I'll have security meet you at the gate." Patricia let out a bitter laugh, one that carried decades of exhaustion and fury. "Good. Call them. I want them to see what you did. I want them to collect the evidence you left on the floor." Her eyes blazed, her body shaking, her voice rising to a roar. "Because what you did wasn't enforcement. It was assault. It was humiliation. It was a hate crime in uniform." The scissors trembled in Linda's hand. For the first time, she looked unsure. Her authority cracked, crumbling under the force of Patricia's words and the growing tide of passengers' whispers. Jordan's chest heaved as he stared at Patricia. For the first time since the first snip, he felt a flicker of hope. Someone saw him. Someone stood for him. Patricia leaned closer into the aisle, her voice low but scorching. "That boy is somebody's son, somebody's legacy, and you dared to put your filthy hands on his crown. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The cabin was no longer silent. It was alive with murmurs, gasps, the clicking of phones recording every second. The atmosphere had shifted. The balance of power was tilting. Linda stepped back slightly, her face pale, her authority slipping through her fingers. For 15 years, she had gotten away with her private tyranny. But now, at 30,000 feet, she had cut the wrong crown. Patricia Moore straightened in her seat, her voice steady now, her eyes locked on Jordan's. "You are not alone. Not anymore." The scissors slipped slightly in Linda's grip. For the first time in years, she realized she had lost control, and the fight for justice, once confined to whispers and silent tears, had just been unleashed into the skies. For a moment, the cabin hung in stunned silence, suspended between disbelief and outrage. The sound of the scissors cutting through Jordan's locks still echoed in the air, like a wound that refused to close. He sat in his seat, broken, his face streaked with tears, his once proud crown mutilated into uneven tufts. His chest rose and fell in shallow sobs. Patricia Moore's voice had already shattered the stillness once, but now she felt something greater building inside her, a fire that no fear of rules or authority could contain. She had watched enough, and her body moved before her mind had fully caught up. She unbuckled her seat belt and stood, her frame tall, her presence commanding. Years of quiet resilience surged into fury. Every long night in the ER, every tear she had wiped from her son's cheeks when the world tried to crush them, every whispered prayer over their safety, all of it converged in this moment. "What is wrong with you?" she thundered at Linda Hayes, her voice vibrating with a force that reached every corner of the cabin. "You cut that boy's hair. You humiliated him in front of everyone for what? To protect your idea of professionalism." Gasps filled the air. Passengers who had stayed silent leaned forward, eyes wide, cameras now raised openly. Linda's composure cracked. She raised a hand defensively, scissors still trembling in her grip. "Ma'am, sit down. You're making a scene. This is a company matter." Patricia's laugh cut through her words, bitter and sharp. A company matter. You just assaulted a young man on this plane. You cut off his heritage, his pride, his identity, and you think you can hide behind policy. Show me the policy. Show me the rule book that gave you the right to put scissors in your hands and strip away his dignity. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A man in the back muttered, "She's right." Another whispered, "That was abuse." Someone else added, "This is going viral right now." Jordan lifted his head, his eyes swollen with tears. For the first time since the first snip, he felt the cabin shifting. Patricia's voice was no longer hers alone. It was carrying the unspoken thoughts of everyone who had watched in silence, turning complicity into conscience. Linda faltered. "I was enforcing standards," she stammered, her voice weaker now, her authority slipping like sand through fingers. It was about presentation, passenger comfort. Patricia stepped closer into the aisle, her finger trembling as she pointed directly at the scattered locks on the floor. Passenger comfort. Whose comfort? Certainly not his. Do you see those pieces of him you left lying there? That's his crown. That's his culture. That's 6 years of care, of love, of history. You butchered it. And for what? To make yourself feel powerful in that uniform. Her words burned like fire through the cabin. Every syllable struck deeper, unraveling Linda's fragile defense. The flight attendant tried again, her voice shaking. "If you don't calm down, I will have security waiting when we land." Patricia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm that carried more weight than her roar. "Good. Call them. I want them here. I want them to see the evidence of what you did. I want them to collect those locks off the floor as proof of your crime." A collective gasp rose as passengers murmured agreement. Phones captured every angle. Linda looked around, realizing with growing dread that she no longer had control. The authority she had hidden behind was collapsing. Jordan's sobs filled the air again, softer now, but raw, every breath weighted with humiliation. Patricia turned to him, her voice gentler, layered with maternal care. "You did nothing wrong, baby. Nothing. Your hair was perfect. You are perfect. Don't you ever believe otherwise." Something snapped inside her then. Maybe it was the sight of his butchered locks scattered like discarded roots. Maybe it was the audacity of Linda's smug face, still holding scissors like a weapon. Or maybe it was decades of accumulated fury, centuries of generational scars pressing down on her soul. Her hand moved before her mind stopped it. The crack of palm against cheek reverberated through the cabin. It wasn't a slap of petty anger. It was the physical manifestation of centuries of exhaustion. A mother's rage condensed into one blow. The sound silenced the entire plane. Passengers gasped. Some cheered under their breath. Others stared in shock. Linda staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in years, she wasn't the enforcer. She was the one held accountable, the one stripped of control. Patricia's voice followed, low and dangerous, each word heavy with conviction. "Don't you ever put your hands on someone else's child. Don't you ever cut another person's crown. That boy's hair was his glory, and you had no right." The words echoed, louder than the engines, louder than the murmurs. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "Amen." Someone else clapped once, then stopped, unsure if it was allowed. The cabin was alive with electricity, a current of outrage and solidarity crackling in the air. Jordan sat frozen, staring at Patricia, his tears slowing, her words wrapped around him like armor, like the prayers his father spoke each morning. For the first time since the violation began, he didn't feel entirely alone. Linda stood trembling, her face burning where Patricia's hand had struck. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The scissors dropped from her hand, clattering against the floor, their metallic clang a final surrender. Passengers whispered louder now. She deserved it. Finally, someone said something. That woman's a hero. Patricia returned to her seat, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run a marathon. Her hand still tingled, but her eyes burned with unshakable conviction. She looked at Jordan again, her voice softer. "You are a king. Don't let this break you." The cabin doors of silence had been blown open. What had started as a quiet humiliation had transformed into a public reckoning, recorded by dozens of phones, streamed to social media before the plane would even land. Jordan leaned back, exhausted, his breath uneven but steadier now. His locks lay scattered on the floor, silent witnesses to his violation. But Patricia's defiance planted something in the air, a spark that would soon ignite far beyond the cabin. For now, though, in row 4, at 30,000 feet, a slap had spoken louder than 1,000 policies. It had declared what no corporate handbook could: dignity was not negotiable, and crowns were not to be touched. The cabin braced in silence again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't complicity. It was anticipation. Something had shifted, and everyone on that flight knew it. Patricia Moore, ER nurse, single mother, protector, had become the voice of the village in the sky, and Linda Hayes, once the quiet tyrant of uniforms and vague rules, stood shaking in the wreckage of her false authority. The war for justice had just been declared, and the world beyond the cabin had no idea what storm was coming. The cabin was buzzing now, the energy thick, like a storm gathering above the clouds. Patricia Moore sat back down in her seat, chest still heaving, her hand tingling from the slap that had silenced the plane. She gripped the armrest, steadying herself, knowing deep down she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But she did not regret it, not for a second. Jordan sat frozen in 4A, staring at the locks scattered around his feet. His body trembled, but his sobs had softened into something different. He looked at Patricia, his eyes swollen but filled with a faint flicker of recognition that someone had stood for him, that he was no longer entirely alone in the humiliation. Phones captured everything. Little red lights blinked across the cabin like fireflies. Passengers whispered, some in shock, some in solidarity. A teenager in row 7 whispered to his mother, "This is going viral." His mother hushed him, but she didn't disagree. Linda Hayes stood pale and trembling near the galley, one hand pressed against her cheek, the other dangling uselessly at her side. The scissors lay abandoned on the floor, glinting like the remnants of a crime. For 15 years, she had hidden her cruelty behind the mask of corporate authority. But in one slap, in one fiery speech, Patricia had exposed her for what she was: a tyrant in uniform. The flight pressed on through the night sky, the engines humming their indifferent tune, while the cabin itself had become a stage, a courtroom, a battlefield of dignity. Jordan reached for his phone with shaking hands. His fingers moved clumsily, but instinct guided him. He opened the front-facing camera and saw his reflection, his locks jagged and butchered, his face streaked with tears, He flinched at the sight, shame washing over him again, but he pressed record anyway. He spoke softly, his voice breaking. "My name is Jordan Miles. I'm 19 years old. I was on this flight to Boston for a science conference. This woman—" He turned the phone, capturing Linda Hayes frozen a few feet away. "She said my hair wasn't professional. She cut my locks, right here, in front of everyone." His chest heaved as he inhaled sharply, struggling to continue. "This is my crown. This is my identity. And she took it from me." His voice cracked into a sob, and he ended the recording abruptly. He stared at the screen for a long moment before pressing upload. Within minutes, the video pinged across networks, bouncing from phone to phone, shared, retweeted, reposted. The footage from other passengers began to circulate too. The snips of scissors, the scattered locks, Patricia's furious defense, the slap. Each angle stitched together into a story too powerful to stay in the confines of a cabin. At first, it spread among friends and family. Then hashtags began forming. Protect the Crown, Justice for Jordan, the slap after DK. By the time the flight crossed over the Rockies, the videos had already begun trending nationwide and thousands of miles away in a glittering office tower in Dubai. A phone buzzed. Marcus Miles was finishing a deal that would add another $200 million to his firm's portfolio. He stood in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the night-lit skyline, shaking hands with investors, his smile polished, his voice measured. He looked every inch the Titan. He was a man who commanded respect in boardrooms across continents. But when his private line buzzed again, flashing the name Evelyn, his mother, Jordan's grandmother, his polished smile faltered. He excused himself, stepping into the quiet of a side office. "Mom," he answered, his voice warm. "I'll call you right back." I'm in the middle of her voice cut through him like a blade. It was broken, frantic, filled with grief. "Marcus, they hurt our boy. They cut his hair. That woman on the plane. She had scissors. She cut off his locks in front of everyone." Marcus froze, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles went white. What his voice was a low growl, trembling with restrained fury. "They butchered his crown." "Marcus." Evelyn wept. "He's crying. He's broken." Some nurse defended him. Thank God. But it's all over the internet. They destroyed him in front of the whole plane. The room tilted around Marcus. The calm mask he wore for investors shattered in an instant. He saw his son's face in his mind, the pride from that morning's call, the glow of hope in his eyes. He saw the locks, each one carefully nurtured, symbols of a heritage he had sworn to protect. And now, he imagined them falling to the cabin floor under the hand of a stranger. "What do you mean they cut his hair?" His voice was ice, dangerous in its calm. Evelyn's sobs grew sharper. The flight attendant had scissors. She said he didn't look professional. She cut his locks. Marcus. She humiliated our boy in front of everyone. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. His breath came slow, deliberate, like a man holding back an explosion. His eyes burned as he looked out the window at the glittering skyline, seeing nothing, only fury. Finally, he spoke, his words a vow carved from stone. Put him on FaceTime. Now. There was shuffling on the other end, muffled voices. Then the camera shifted. And there he was. Jordan's face filled the screen. His cheeks were wet with tears. His locks were mangled, jagged, hacked away. He looked less like the confident young man Marcus had spoken to that morning and more like a child gutted by the cruelty of the world. "Dad," Jordan sobbed, his voice small. "She said I didn't belong here. She cut my crown." Marcus felt something inside him break. His chest ached with a grief so sharp it almost stole his breath. But beneath the grief burned something far more dangerous rage, cold and absolute. He steadied his voice, forcing himself to become the pillar his son needed. "Look at me, son. Look into my eyes." Jordan's trembling gaze lifted to the screen. "There is nothing wrong with you," Marcus said, each word steady, deliberate. "There was never anything wrong with your hair. Your crown is magnificent, and it will be magnificent again. What that woman did was not policy. It was not authority. It was assault. It was hate. And I swear to you, on my life, she and the company that empowered her will face consequences that will echo for a generation." Jordan's lips trembled. He nodded weakly, whispering, "Okay." "Dad?" Marcus ended the call, staring at his own reflection in the black glass of the office window. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with fury. The grieving father was gone. In his place stood a weapon, a strategist, a titan, a man about to wage war. He picked up his second phone, dialing numbers with ruthless precision. His voice was steady, sharp, each call a missile. The CEO of the Airline, a federal official he had once done a favor for, his attorney, a journalist, his chief investment officer, the president of the Attendant CP. Each word he spoke was measured, but behind the calm tone was a storm. "Your employee just committed a federal hate crime against my son. The video is already viral. You have 7 minutes to act before I dismantle you, one by one." He launched the strikes, his calls slicing through the night like blades. Back on the plane, Jordan sat trembling, unaware of the war machine his father had just set into motion. Patricia leaned across the aisle, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You hold your head up," she whispered. "This isn't the end of your story. This is the beginning of theirs." The engines roared on. The cabin sat heavy with the aftermath of humiliation, the aftershock of defiance, and the invisible storm gathering on the horizon, because Marcus Miles was coming, and when he arrived, the skies themselves would tremble. Marcus Miles stood alone in the side office of the glittering Dubai Tower. The city lights blazing beneath him like sparks scattered across the desert night. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like the polished executive who had just closed a deal. His eyes were darker now, his jaw rigid, his voice sharpened to a blade. His son's butchered face lingered in his mind, replaying again and again. The locks he had watched grow since boyhood were gone, severed by arrogance and cruelty at 30,000 feet. The image struck deeper than any business loss ever could. It wasn't just humiliation. It was desecration. Marcus breathed once, steady and deliberate, then picked up his phone. His empire wasn't just money. It was connections, influence, leverage, and tonight, every ounce of it would be weaponized. The clock in his head started ticking. 7 minutes, that's all it would take. The first number he dialed was Amelia Price, CEO of Global Skies, the very airline where Linda Hayes had made her fatal mistake. They had shared dinners at conferences, traded favors on charity boards. Marcus's investment firm held nearly 5% of the company's shares. When her voice answered, polite and warm, she had no idea her world was already ending. "Marcus," she said brightly, "what a surprise. Did you finish the—" Her voice froze when she heard his tone. Low, deadly. "One of your employees at 30,000 feet just committed a hate crime against my son. She cut his hair with scissors because she said his locks weren't professional. The video is already viral." There was silence on the line. Amelia tried to speak, but he cut her off. "You have exactly 7 minutes to fire her, have her arrested, and issue a public, personal apology to my son. If you fail, I will not only divest my firm's holdings, I will personally fund a short-selling campaign that will bankrupt your airline within a week. Marcus, that's 6 minutes, 40 seconds, he snapped, his voice cracking like thunder. Decide if your brand survives the night." He hung up before she could answer. The second call went to Jonathan Cross, a senior official at the Federal Aviation Administration. Years ago, Marcus had shielded him from a scandal that would have ended his career. Now, the debt was due. "Jonathan," Marcus said, his voice a calm storm, "I need a federal investigation launched into global skies immediately. Systemic civil rights violations, an assault on a minor at 30,000 feet. I'm sending you video evidence now. I want a press release out within the hour." Cross stammered. "Marcus, you know investigations take—" "Not this one." Marcus cut in. "This one moves tonight. Or I call Senator Keaton tomorrow and ask why the FAA is protecting hate crimes in the sky. Do your job. 5 minutes left." The third call was to David Lynn, his attorney. David was a pit bull in a suit, known for dismantling corporations with surgical precision. "David, prepare filings, assault on a minor, emotional distress, federal hate crime statutes. I want everything stacked. I don't want settlement talks. I want a number so staggering it rewrites precedent. And subpoena every discrimination complaint Global Skies has buried in the last 20 years. David's voice sharpened with excitement. "Consider it done." The fourth call went to Susan Whitaker, a Pulitzer-winning journalist at the New York Times. She owed her career-defining scoop to Marcus's discreet tip years earlier. "Susan, check your inbox. I just sent you video evidence that will be the biggest civil rights story in aviation history. I want it above the fold tomorrow. Headline, Airline cuts crown. You run it, or I take it to your competitor." "Marcus," she whispered, already clicking open the files. "My God, 4 minutes left," he said, then ended the call. The fifth number dialed belonged to his chief investment officer, Michael Tan. "Mike, dump every Global Skies share we own, 3.6 million units. Short the stock with every legal dollar, call CalPERS, Harvard's endowment, every fund we touch. Tell them Carter Capital's out, and if they don't follow, they'll get burned. Move fast." Mike didn't hesitate. On it. The sixth call went to Angela Dubois, president of the NAACP, a close ally from Marcus's years funding civil rights lawsuits. "Angela, a flight attendant cut my son's locks on camera. The video is viral. I need a national boycott. Press conferences in 10 cities by tomorrow morning. Every celebrity, every athlete on our list posts this now. Make it a movement." Angela's voice tightened with fury. "Say no more. Consider it done." The final call went to Senator Charles Keating, chair of the Commerce Committee, who owed Marcus favors that went back decades. "Charles," Marcus said, his tone now ice, "tomorrow you announce hearings on civil rights violations in aviation. If you don't, I'll remind voters how you've been sleeping on campaign donations tied to global skies. This isn't optional." The senator sputtered. Marcus hung up. 7 minutes had passed. 7 calls, each a missile launched at the heart of the airline. Marcus stood in the office, chest heaving, phone still hot in his hand. Outside, the glittering city of Dubai pulsed with indifference, but the storm he had unleashed was already racing across oceans and time zones. Back on the plane, Jordan sat slumped in his seat, staring at the fragments of his crown scattered on the floor. Patricia leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Hold on, baby. The world is watching now, and I promise you, this isn't the end. It's the start of something bigger." Her words comforted him, though he still trembled. He didn't know that while he sat broken in row 4A, his father had just set the sky on fire. In Global Sky's headquarters in New York, Amelia Price's phone buzzed nonstop as stock alerts blared across her screen. The video had hit 1 million views in under an hour. Just justice for Jordan was the #1 trend worldwide. Investors were panicking. Her board members were calling. In Washington, Jonathan Cross was drafting an emergency statement for the press. In Los Angeles, journalists were already piecing together the story for the morning front page. In New York, the NAACP was lining up cameras for a midnight press conference. And in financial markets, Global Sky's shares were plummeting. On the plane, the scissors still lay on the carpet, gleaming under the cabin light. Forgotten by the one who had wielded them, but not forgotten by the dozens of lenses that had captured their fall. Jordan closed his eyes, whispering to himself words his grandmother had sent in that desperate text. "Don't let anyone touch your crown." The truth of it seared deeper now than ever before. He didn't know yet how powerful the storm would become. He didn't know yet that his name would soon headline newspapers, trend on every platform, echo in courtrooms and congressional halls. He only knew he was broken, humiliated, aching, but outside, in boardrooms, newsrooms, and trading floors, his pain had become fire. His father's fury had become a weapon, and the world was about to learn what happened when you tried to cut the crown of a king. The hours stretched heavy inside the aircraft, but there was no peace, not after the scissors, not after the slap, not after the whispers had turned into a roar of cameras and quiet outrage. The hum of the engines continued, but for the passengers of Flight 162, the flight was no longer ordinary. It had become history in motion. Jordan Miles sat slumped in his seat, a blanket draped over his shoulders that a sympathetic passenger had quietly handed him. His head leaned against the cool window, his reflection a haunting reminder of what had been stolen from him. The uneven tufts where his locks had once flowed made him look like a stranger to himself. Every time he caught the reflection, he flinched. His chest was still heavy with shame, but across the aisle, Patricia Moore kept watch, her eyes burning with the resolve of a protector. Every so often, she leaned toward him, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Baby, this isn't the end of you. Do you hear me? What they tried to take can never be taken. Your crown is still yours, even if it's not on your head right now." Jordan nodded faintly, clinging to her words. Somewhere inside him, the spark she'd lit refused to go out completely. At the front of the cabin, Linda Hayes tried to compose herself. She had retreated to the galley after the slap, her cheeks still red, her hands trembling. She had always been in control, the enforcer of rules no one questioned. But now the rules were slipping through her fingers. Her authority, once unquestioned, had collapsed under the weight of a single passenger's defiance and 100 recording phones. She whispered to herself, as if repeating it could make it true. I was just enforcing standards. Just enforcing standards. But the words rang hollow, even to her own ears. The captain's voice broke through the cabin intercom, his tone unusually tense. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as we continue our journey. I want to remind you to remain seated as we prepare for a secure arrival. Thank you for your cooperation. The phrasing was deliberate. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. Secure arrival. They all understood what it meant. Security would be waiting at the gate. And indeed, in Los Angeles, officials were already being mobilized. Marcus Miles's 7-minute war had triggered a cascade of actions that no corporate damage control could contain. Amelia Price, the Airline CEO, had been forced to call the airport police directly. Federal agents had been notified by Jonathan Cross at the FAA, and the video Jordan's trembling testimony, the footage of Linda Hayes cutting his locks, Patricia Moore's fiery speech, and the slap was already dominating headlines by the time the plane began its descent into Boston. Justice for Jordan had racked up 30 million views. News anchors were cutting into broadcasts. Commentators were calling it the most explosive civil rights case in aviation history. Inside the cabin, tension thickened as the seatbelt signs flickered on. Linda reemerged, attempting to project calm, but every step betrayed her fear. Passengers shifted away from her as if she carried contagion. Their stares were no longer passive. They were judgment. Jordan pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He whispered under his breath, "Grandma said, never let anyone touch my crown. I couldn't stop her. I couldn't." His voice cracked. Patricia leaned in, her hand covering his. "Listen to me, baby. You stood. You resisted as much as you could, and the world saw what she did. The shame isn't yours. It's hers." The tires screeched against the runway, jolting the cabin. The plane slowed, taxied toward the gate. Everyone braced for the aftermath. When the doors opened, the scene was unlike anything the passengers had ever witnessed. A line of uniformed officers stood waiting at the jet bridge, flanked by federal agents. Behind them, cameras flashed from journalists who had been tipped off before the wheels even touched the ground. Linda Hayes, a stern officer, called as soon as the crew began disembarking. His voice carried into the cabin, silencing every murmur. "You are being taken into custody for assault." Linda's face drained of color. She turned to protest, but her words caught in her throat. Officers stepped forward, firm but professional, as they guided her out in handcuffs. Gasps erupted. Some passengers clapped softly. Others simply filmed. For the first time, Linda Hayes, the self-proclaimed guardian of cabin standards, wasn't issuing commands. She was the one being escorted, powerless, disgraced. Her career collapsing with each flash of a camera. Jordan watched, numb. His heart thudded heavily, unsure whether to feel vindicated or more broken. The sight of her led away didn't restore what she had taken. His crown was still on the floor, hacked apart. His humiliation was still raw, but Patricia's words echoed in his ears. The shame wasn't his. As the passengers filed out, many stopped by Jordan's seat. Some placed hands on his shoulder. Some whispered words of encouragement. "Stay strong. You didn't deserve this. We saw everything." Their compassion wrapped around him like threads of a community he hadn't realized he had on this flight. Patricia walked with him down the jet bridge, steady as a shield. Outside, the lights of cameras blinded them. Reporters shouted questions. What happened on board Jordan? How do you feel? Do you think the airline should be shut down? Patricia raised her arm like a barrier. Give him space, she commanded, her voice steady and maternal. This boy doesn't need vultures right now. He needs dignity. Airport staff guided Jordan into a private lounge, where security formed a wall against the chaos outside. He collapsed into a chair, pulling the blanket around himself tighter. Patricia stayed close, refusing to leave his side. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Marcus Miles's jet was cutting through the night sky toward Boston. He had boarded it less than an hour after the call with his mother, fueled by pure fury. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since reporters, politicians, activists, investors. He answered only the calls that mattered, each one another nail in the coffin of global skies. As he stared out the cabin window, the storm inside him raged. He saw again and again the image of his son's hacked hair, the tears, the humiliation. Every snip was seared into his mind. Every sob was a wound. He whispered into the dark cabin, a promise only the stars could hear. Hold on, son, I'm coming, and when I land, the world will burn for you. Back in Boston, Jordan sat in the lounge, Patricia's hand resting over his, anchoring him in the storm. He was silent, lost in thought. Shame still clung to him, heavy as a shadow, but deep inside, a seed had been planted not just by his father's vow, not just by Patricia's fury, but by the sheer magnitude of the response outside those glass doors. The world was watching. The world was listening. And the boy who had been broken in row 4A was about to become the symbol of something far larger than himself. The private lounge in Boston Logan Airport was quiet, too quiet compared to the chaos raging just beyond its glass doors. The muffled roar of cameras and reporters seeped faintly through the walls. Inside, the silence wrapped itself around Jordan Miles like a heavy blanket, the kind that did not comfort but suffocated. He sat hunched in a chair, wrapped in the same thin airline blanket. His reflection in the darkened window startled him each time his eyes wandered. The jagged, butchered hairline mocked him. The uneven tufts a reminder of the violence done to him. His crown, 6 years of careful patience, of mourning rituals, of heritage carried on his head, was scattered now somewhere in the vacuum bags of a cleaning crew. Patricia Moore sat nearby, her hands folded, her body radiating presence like a guardrail. She didn't speak much, only when she noticed Jordan's breaths growing too shallow, when his shoulders curled inward like he wanted to disappear. Then she would lean in, her voice calm and low. Baby, don't bow your head, not now. You did nothing wrong. She did. The world knows it. Jordan nodded faintly each time, but the shame was not so easily washed away. The door opened suddenly. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the room like a storm. His suit was immaculate despite the long flight, but his face carried a gravity that drew every gaze. His eyes found Jordan instantly. "Dad," Jordan whispered. Marcus Miles didn't speak at first. He strode across the room, and when he reached his son, he knelt, wrapping his arms around him with a ferocity that broke the dam Jordan had been holding inside. The boy wept into his father's chest, sobs shaking his whole body. "I'm sorry, I wasn't there," Marcus whispered, his own voice breaking despite years of training it to remain unshakable. "I should have been here to protect you." Jordan clung to him tighter, words spilling out between gasps. She said I didn't belong. She cut my hair. She cut my crown. Dad, I tried to stop her, but I couldn't. I let her. No, Marcus said firmly, pulling back just enough to look his son in the eye. His own eyes glistened, but his tone was steel. You didn't let her. She stole from you. That shame isn't yours, son. It's hers. And trust me, the world is going to remember it as hers. Jordan searched his father's face, finding there not only love but fury, controlled and sharpened into something more dangerous. For a moment, Jordan felt the strength he had always admired in his father, now weaponized in his defense. Behind them, Patricia rose, her eyes misty as she watched the reunion. Marcus turned to her, recognition flashing across his face. You, he said, stepping toward her. You stood for him when no one else did. You defended my son. His voice cracked just slightly, but his eyes were fierce. You'll never know what that means to me. Patricia nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. When I saw him, I saw my own boys. I couldn't let it go. Marcus extended his hand, then instead embraced her briefly, a gesture of gratitude words could not contain. Within hours, the fire Marcus had ignited was raging uncontrollably. Global Sky's stock collapsed 28% in after-hours trading. Investors fled in droves. By dawn, the CEO, Amelia Price, had issued a frantic public apology, her face tight with fear as she condemned the actions of one rogue employee. But it was far too late. Federal agents had already raided company offices, seizing files on decades of passenger complaints. The FAA announced a sweeping investigation into discriminatory practices in aviation. Politicians lined up behind microphones, each declaring that this kind of violation has no place in America's skies. But the most devastating blow came from Marcus himself. With David Lynn, his pit bull attorney, he filed a lawsuit for $50 million not just for damages, but for precedent. Assault on a minor, violation of federal civil rights protections, emotional trauma. The filing demanded systemic reform, not just settlement. And the courts, the media, and the public all knew Marcus Miles didn't bluff. Over the next year, the consequences unraveled with the precision of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Global Skies settled the case, paying the unprecedented $50 million. $20 million went into a trust for Jordan's future. The other $30 million seeded something far greater. The Crown Legacy Foundation, its mission was clear. Threefold: provide legal firepower for victims of appearance-based discrimination, fund scholarships for students of color in STEM, and enforce corporate anti-bias training with real, measurable consequences. Jordan, once humiliated, became its beating heart. With time, his locks regrew, styled into an intricate updo for his first public appearance at MIT, where he accepted a scholarship he had earned long before the incident defined him. On stage, facing an auditorium of students, leaders, and activists, Jordan spoke with a voice steadier than he ever imagined possible. They tried to cut my crown. They thought they could strip away my dignity. But what they really did was plant seeds. And those seeds have grown into this movement not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been told they didn't belong. The ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Patricia Moore stood in the front row, tears streaming as she clapped. She had not sought recognition, but the world had given it to her anyway. The video of her slap had become a rallying cry, a symbol of communal defense. She had become a national figure, using her platform to advocate for the Crown Act, federal legislation banning hair-based discrimination. The act passed within the year, signed in the Rose Garden, where Patricia, Marcus, and Jordan stood beside the president. As the ink dried, the president declared, "Your hair is your heritage. It is your identity. And today, it is protected under the law of this land." For Linda Hayes, the fall was brutal. Convicted of assault and federal hate crime charges, she was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. Her name became synonymous with ruin, a cautionary tale whispered in HR offices. Don't be a Linda Hayes. But for Jordan, the journey was more profound than vengeance. It was transformation. He spoke often about scars, how they never fade, but they can be repurposed. My scar, he told a crowd at an AACP gala, running a hand over the regrown locks tied neatly at the back of his head, isn't a reminder of weakness. It's a shield. It reminds me of what I survived, and it reminds the world of what must never happen again. His father watched proudly from the audience. Their morning ritual continued the 6:30 hymn call, though now it was less prayer and more planning. They strategized about scholarships, advocacy, court cases. "You taught me something, son," Marcus said one morning. "I spent my life building an empire of wealth. You've shown me the true empire is justice. Legacy. That's the real inheritance." Jordan smiled softly. "Then we'll build it together." The ripple effects spread far and wide. Airlines rewrote their grooming policies, explicitly protecting cultural expression. Corporations nationwide instituted mandatory anti-bias training, and young men and women of color wore their crowns with renewed defiance, walking into classrooms, offices, and boardrooms with heads held high. 1 year later, Jordan boarded a flight again at Boston Logan. The gate was the same. The staff was different. This time, the lead attendant, a young Latina woman with braids cascading down her back, smiled warmly. "Mr. Miles," she said softly, her voice catching, "I just want to thank you. Because of you, I don't have to straighten my hair anymore to feel professional. You changed everything for us." Jordan smiled, emotion swelling in his chest. He boarded with quiet dignity, taking his business class seat. He opened his phone and called his father. "Dad," he said, gazing out the window as the engines roared, "same gate, same plane, but the world is different." Marcus's voice, steady and proud, came through the line. "How does it feel?" Son Jordan leaned back, his locks gleaming under the cabin light. He whispered with quiet triumph, "It feels like we won, not just for me, for everyone." And as the plane ascended into the clouds, Jordan Miles smiled, not as a victim, but as a king whose crown had not been stolen, only transformed into a legacy. When the scissors hit Jordan's crown, they weren't just cutting hair. They were cutting into history, identity, and pride. But out of that pain came something larger than any one flight, larger than any one family. It became a movement. Jordan's father, Marcus, turned grief into fire and fire into reform. Patricia Moore, a stranger with the heart of a mother, reminded the world that silence is complicity. And Jordan himself, broken in one moment, rose to become a symbol of resilience, showing us all that scars can become shields. The truth is, racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides behind uniforms, policies, and professional standards. But as this story proves, when injustice rears its head, it only takes one person to say enough, and the world can change. So let this story linger with you. Let it make you love harder, respect deeper, and fight louder against the small cruelties that add up to great injustices. Because protecting someone's crown isn't just about hair, it's about humanity. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe so together we can keep telling the stories that shake the skies and demand justice.